In most people's imagination, city walls were built to keep enemies out. But in China, city walls served another, more important purpose: keeping people in. This is not an exaggeration. It reveals a fact that is often overlooked. Chinese city walls and European castles were never solving the same problem. The Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an covered 84 square kilometers. Nearly 1 million people were enclosed within a single square wall. By design, the city was divided into 108 blocks called fong, each with its own walls and gates, open during the day, sealed at night. Where you lived, where you traded, where you traveled, all of it fell under the zoning system. The entire city was not a space that grew freely. It was a management grid, planned from the start. At the same time in Europe, a ruler as powerful as Charlemagne concentrated his core power inside a stone fortress housing a few hundred people. The world of ordinary people lay outside the walls. On one side, an entire city was enclosed. On the other, the smallest possible space was used to protect a single man. Why? Because what they were trying to protect was never the same thing. In China, population was national strength. Tax revenue, conscripted labor, military manpower, all of it came from population. Once people slipped out of control, tax revenue collapsed, soldiers vanished, and the empire would rapidly lose its ability to function. So the wall's purpose was not just to defend against external enemies. More importantly, it was to keep people inside a controllable space. A square wall encloses the maximum area for a given perimeter, fitting the most people inside. This was not an aesthetic choice. It was a management requirement. The design inside the walls followed the same logic. For over 2,000 years, the city building logic appeared again and again. Square shape, grid layout, central axis. Easy to zone, easy to register households, easy to control. This was not the unique design of any single city. It was a philosophy of city building that ran through all of Chinese history. Europe took a completely different path. After the fall of Rome, power fragmented. There was no unified central government, no nationwide household registration system. Each lord was the king of his own territory. Who did he need to protect? Himself, his family, and his armed men. Peasants lived outside the castle walls, and the castle gates would not open for them. So European castles pursued not spatial scale, but defensive strength. Thicker walls, taller towers, structures built to fit the terrain. The goal was to use the smallest space to protect the most essential people. What a lord cared about was the size of his land, not the size of his population. If people ran away, the land remained. What Chinese emperors feared most was exactly that: people running away. The household registration system tied every person to a specific place, and the city wall was the physical boundary of that system. Inside the wall, you were inside the system. Outside the wall, you were beyond its reach. This is why every dynasty in Chinese history was extremely vigilant about Liumin, displaced people. Displaced people meant population, escape and control network, and that was often where rebellions began. This difference ultimately shaped two completely different urban cultures. Chinese cities were planned from the top down. The court drew the blueprint first, then built the city, and residents were placed into it. European cities grew from the bottom up. Merchants set up stalls outside a castle. Stalls became markets. Markets became towns, and towns demanded self-governance. The European tradition of self-governing cities emerged precisely because there was no great wall enclosing everyone within a unified managed space. Square walls versus European castles. This was never a question of which was more advanced. China chose centralized management, and it was extraordinarily efficient. For 2,000 years, it repeatedly assembled the largest empires in human history. The cost was that life inside the walls was highly regimented. Europe chose decentralized self-governance, which was more flexible and ultimately gave rise to self-governing cities and civil society. The cost was prolonged fragmentation and frequent war. Architecture is never just architecture. Every wall is a civilization's answer to a fundamental question: who deserves to be protected? China's answer: everyone, because everyone is part of the system. Europe's answer: the core, because as long as the core survives, the system can be rebuilt. Today, most of China's ancient city walls have been torn down, but if you look carefully at a Chinese city, the perfectly square blocks, the orderly grid, the clearly defined functional zones, you can still see the shadow of an invisible wall. The wall has disappeared, but the logic of keeping people inside has not. It's simply changed from brick and stone into institutions.